This is the Detroit Sports Podcast Network.
Some noteworthy trends heading into the 2020 college football season, and yes, there will be one. Next on Michigan Podcast.
There's going to be one team that's going to play solely as a team. No man is more important than the team. No coach is more important than the team. The team, the team, the team.
Looks deep for Anthony Clark. Waits for it. Tip. Caught.
This is no time for that. In the pocket and a sack. Tim Jamison.
Brady gets terrific. Throws it and a touchdown. Knight again. Schultz just before Brazil got him. And a leaping interception by Woodson.
Harbaugh back to throw over the middle. Caught by Collier at the 5 on his feet. Touchdown, Michigan. On its way. It's good.
He's 5'7", 179 pounds, a junior at Michigan. But Jamie Morris hacks a wall of him, and he delivers for Bo Schembechler.
And here's your first play. Pressure coming. Sack. It is Glenn Steele, number 81, who fought his way through the traffic.
Option. And Robinson calls his own number, and he's going to score. Oh, an easy touchdown for Robinson and Michigan.
Win it. We're going to win the championship again because we're going to play as a team. And when we play as a team and the old season is over, you and I know it's going to be Michigan again. Michigan.
Go Blue, I'm Steve Deace. Welcome to this week's episode of Michigan Podcast. The season draws nigh. In fact, all over the country, preseason preparations have formally begun as of last Friday. Teams were able to begin practicing with coaches and even with a ball. That's right. You can practice football with a football now. They're not in pads yet, but the season draws nigh, and that's where I want to begin. Yes, we've got some noteworthy trends heading into the season. I do this every year. It's always a ton of fun to kind of see where things stand heading into a new campaign before we open up those presents on Christmas morn, and Mark Rogers will join us in our 10-minute war next segment as we go through those trends and get his take on them as well. But I want to begin with a public service announcement. Last night, I was in downtown Des Moines, where I live, here in Des Moines, Iowa. I was in downtown Des Moines at our AAA baseball stadium, Principal Park, enjoying the state high school baseball tournament. Outdoors, socially distanced, with a crowd that was limited in size, got to see two of the best baseball teams in our state in a AAA professional baseball stadium play an exciting extra innings game that was determined 2-1. A little slice of Americana, a little slice of normalcy. And it begs the question, if this can be done with high school sports in Iowa, why can't it be done with college sports all over the country? In fact, I want to show you a couple of key graphics here, pieces of information. Look at these stats from my home state. Now, why do you care if you don't live in Iowa? Because Iowa was the first state in the union to bring back high school sports. So look at these stats and keep in mind, we had no framework. We had no precedent. We were the guinea pigs here. We kind of had to go with the protocols recommended by CDC, local health officials, and others, and then kind of see what was feasible and what works. And look at these results. 335 varsity softball teams played. Only 26 were impacted by COVID-19, which means 92% were not. Only 11 had to end their seasons early because they had a positive test. 97% of the softball teams in our state finished their seasons. Look at baseball, 338 varsity teams, only 21 impacted by COVID-19. 94% were not, only 12 out of 338 had to end a season early because of positive tests, which means 96% of those high school athletes in baseball got to start and finish their seasons. And again, these are over 300 schools all over the state. They're not in a bubble somewhere where they're sequestered and being closely monitored. They get back in their cars or their buses, go right back home, live a normal life the entire week long, at least as much normal as we're allowed and permitted these days, and even sporadically spread throughout the state. You can see how little of an impact this ultimately had. Yes, there were hiccups, there were controversies. There always is when you're dealing with a serious situation and you're trying to deal with it in a new way for the first time. It got clunky at times. Some teams, one positive test, we had one number 1 ranked softball team give up its season because of a positive test, and it happened within the 2-week quarantine period. That was the end of the season. So by the time that person could come back, or the team was given the green light, the season was over. So it wasn't a perfect scenario, but it was a workable one. It was a successful one. I think a lot of the debate that we're having about this virus is this idea that there's a perfect scenario out there, one that doesn't require any risk, a utopian, idealistic notion that we can come up with an outcome that everybody will be pleased and blessed by. I wish that was the case, but then it would be a place called an actual utopia, wouldn't it? We don't live in such a place. We live here on the third rock from the sun. And sometimes in an imperfect world, you can't make the perfect an enemy of the good. That we need to understand that there are forces at work within this creation that are bigger and larger than us. And our job in and around those things is to do our best to keep people as safe as we can, but also understanding that as a species, we have a role to play here. We have a calling here, and that is to advance. That is to move on. That is to improve, to learn, to grow, to achieve. And we can't do those things locked down in our homes, hiding from a virus that only threatens the lives of 0.04% of Americans that don't live in a nursing home. So having said that, let's have some more normalcy. Let's look ahead to the football season we're about to have and where things stand with a lot of the top programs in the country when we return. Want to thank all of you who have been supporting us on Patreon these last few years here on Michigan Podcast. And for those of you that ask us every now and then, hey, what can we do to help support what you guys are doing and help it to grow? Well, supporting us on Patreon is a big way you can do that. Patreon.com/Michigan Podcast. And as you can see, when you become a $5 a month subscriber and supporter or more, you get as well exclusive content that we publish just for you on our Patreon page, including a lot of the stuff that I do with sports handicapping as legalization goes wider throughout the country. In fact, you can see I put up just a couple of weeks ago the notes for NFL win totals, looking at the schedule release. So a lot more where that came from if you want to support us at patreon.com/Michigan Podcast. Let's get to it. It's the 10-minute war with our good friend and the one and probably only reasonable, sane Ohio State fan, Mark Rogers, the voice of college football. Good to see you, brother. How are you?
I'm doing just fine, Steve. I vow to defy that title. At some point, I'm going to get there. I'm going to take you to the brink.
At some point, I'm going to say something so unreasonable, you got to do me like Woody Hayes did the down markers in Ann Arbor back in 1971 before either one of us was born, right?
Well, you're spared by social distancing, Steve.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll just put on a mask. And then I don't have to worry about anything you do to me. I'm totally safe, right? That's how it works.
Everything's solved.
Yes, yeah. There you go. All right, so I've done this the last couple of seasons. I know you've liked it when you've seen it. Just to come up with some interesting trends, kind of setting the stage of where things are at heading into another Christmas morn known as college football season, right? The anticipation of opening the presents is even better than sometimes than the presents themselves, right? So this is my annual look at key trends that kind of give us a portrait of the landscape of the sport heading into a new campaign. There's a bunch of these. So we're going to go through these kind of rapid fire, right? And you're going to be the one that gives me the take. I came up with the nugget, so you give me the hot take on it, okay?
Got it.
Let's begin. Here's our very first one. After losing 4 games in a season only once between 1969 and 2001, which is an amazing stat, by the way, Nebraska has lost at least 4 games for 16 straight seasons, Mark Rogers.
Bo Pelini's not so bad, is he? Devaney and Osborne built a program at a time in which Passing and catching skills were not premium. Speed was not premium. It was a game of brute force and size. They built a program based on the location in the country. For Nebraska to reach those heights based on the recruiting footprint and trying to get those elite players out of other parts of the country is near impossible. Yes, Nebraska can be Wisconsin, but can they be Nebraska of 1995? No.
All right, next up, check this one out. Jim Harbaugh is the first coach in Michigan history to start 0-6 against Ohio State.
I'll have my Buckeye Nation all over me, but the difference and the gap between the two programs is not as substantial as the scores over the last two seasons. Look at Penn State, look at Michigan. They're basically the same program on the field and in the recruiting rankings, and Ohio State is scraping by Penn State. There's an interesting dynamic that goes beyond this rapid-fire conversation right now, but Ohio State's a top 5 program. Michigan's a top 15 program. This will end at some point.
It's actually 0-5. I've been waiting for people to catch that.
Well, I called it.
Okay.
It was the trend.
I've been waiting. I'm already just chalking it up, right? Okay. But I'm surprised at how few people realized that just kind of went with it and said, oh yeah, absolutely. Okay. So, which makes me hurt too. The Miami Hurricanes, remember the U? They have not posted double figures in wins, Mark, in consecutive seasons in 16 years. And since they only won 6, hold on a second. And since they only won 6 games last year, that streak will continue, Mark.
So this fell into my lap from a post that I sent up a couple months ago, basically articulating the marginal status of this program. It's a 57% winning percentage for Miami over the last 15 years. Get this, Steve. There have been 43 teams that have placed in the final AP poll top 10 in the last 15 years, and Miami is not one of them.
Wow.
They got a few stragglers like Boise State and others in the group of 5 in Notre Dame. That's 7 to 8 per Power 5 conference. Miami's not one of them. But the recruiting has been really good. Manny Diaz is an inexperienced coach. He has yet to prove anything. But in an awful division with that kind of talent in their backyard, this has to change to some degree.
Now that's a stat, brother. That is a stat. All right, let's get to this next one. 8 of the last 11 Heisman Trophy winners were 20-1 odds or worse to win it in the preseason. The era of the preseason Heisman candidate Joey Harrington's bust at Times Square and the automatic guy that was close last year and is going to win it hands down next year, that era is done. 8 of the last 11 were 20-1 odds or worse to win it in the preseason, Mark.
I think Geno Smith was supposed to be automatic after 6 games as well. I always find it amusing when people ask me all offseason who's going to win the Heisman Trophy, and I said, my response is basically, you're asking me to predict what somebody else is going to select. You're not asking me who's going to win a football game, but who is going to be chosen by a number of other people. So I don't put a whole lot of weight on the Heisman Trophy, even though I think it's the most prestigious award in sports. It is the most unpredictable to a certain extent, that there has to be a preseason list for not only the Heisman Trophy, but these other awards. I don't get. Is there a preseason selection list for the Major League Baseball MVP or the NFL MVP? No, we just give it to the player that earned it.
Next data nugget, kind of setting the stage for 2020. Texas hasn't had consecutive double-digit win seasons in a decade.
USC at times gets pinned with being the underachieving program, but USC has been substantially better over the past decade than Texas. Of course, Charlie Strong was a complete failure as a head coach in that situation. And this has been the program that has recruited in the top 5 to 10 in the nation during that late Mac Brown tenure into Charlie Strong. And now Tom Herman has yet to turn it around, despite that one glimpse 2 years ago in winning the Sugar Bowl. I don't expect this to continue, but it is they are the poster child for not being able to develop top-line talent.
Texas and Georgia are the only 2 schools that come into this season with the 2018 and 19 recruiting classes that make up the bulk of your roster this year. They're the only 2 teams that had top 3 recruiting classes both of those years, Texas and Georgia. Something to keep in mind. All right, Texas A&M, let's stay in the Lone Star State. Texas A&M has only 1 double-digit win season so far this century, Mark Rogers, and that was Johnny Manziel's Heisman Trophy season of 2012. For their other double-digit win year, you got to go back to R.C. Slocum, kind of the end of his run from Southwestern Conference to Big 12, 1999.
This is the most ballyhooed, hyped-up program that has done nothing for decades and decades. Kevin Sumlin recruited well. They have the wealth of talent, Texas being one of the top 3 recruiting states in the nation, along with California and Florida. The fans love the program. They packed the house with 105,000 rabid fans. They have the money, the facilities, and of course they've piled it all into Jimbo Fisher's contract in the last couple of years. So we'll see if he can deliver. But yeah, Johnny Manziel made it happen that 1 year. But other than that, this is a 7-5, 8-4 program.
As we continue on, Oklahoma and Clemson are each vying to become the first 6 consecutive undisputed, meaning unshared, first 6 consecutive undisputed conference champions since Bud Wilkinson's legendary Sooner teams of the 1950s. That's some high cotton right there, Mark.
I've done a series recently reviewing national championship races in the 80s and 90s, and I knew it before the research, but it just came back to me, the parity in college football at that point. You could go through all the conferences and grab about 5 teams that over the span of 10 to 15 years seriously contended for a national championship. We don't have that anymore. We have 5 or 6 teams to talk about when we talk about the college football playoff. And there's a difference, Utah, Oregon, Oklahoma, even to a certain extent, in reaching the college football playoff versus winning the college football playoff. But Oklahoma, Clemson, I think I'm going to give Clemson or Oklahoma actually a little bit more credit in being able to accomplish that feat in the Big 12 versus what Clemson has done in the pathetic ACC.
All right, our next one, Kansas State, is the first team in at least 3 years to return 0 offensive line starts on the entire roster.
Steve, I got to say, this is the first one I don't know what to do with to a certain extent. I think the probabilities say the offensive line having 5 starters on the field would be the group that obviously brings back the most players that you have to fill positions. So it would make sense that you would be able to bring somebody back from the previous year's unit. But otherwise, I don't know what that's telling us, but that Kansas State needs to work up front here in 2020, I guess.
Well, this is one of the new kind of advanced metric stats in the last few years is the offensive line starts. And because that's a unit where cohesion experience matters quite a bit, obviously. And it's a developmental unit, even, big time programs that are recruiting at that elite level, Clemson, Alabama, in any given year, and they're not playing any more than 1 freshman in the offensive line, for example. So to come back with 0 and have that not be done in college football for 3 years, that's tough to do. And to do it in a year with no offseason like we typically have, yikes. All right, next up, tell me what you think of this one, Mark, from Gary Patterson, Hall of Fame coach, but he has won 7 or fewer games at TCU in 3 of the last 4 years.
I'm not going to take the trend here. I love Gary Patterson. I think he does a great job. You know what I think this speaks to? I think this speaks to him not being able to find a quarterback that can play worth anything over the past several seasons. They have had putrid quarterback play at TCU, and I think that's basically what's happened to Gary Patterson. He had a bit of a rough go transitioning from Group of 5 play into the Big 12. It took a couple of years to transition, and now he's finding a difficult spot again. But go get yourself a quarterback, Gary. I still believe in you.
That's especially true in the league that he plays in the Big 12. Usually the team that has the best quarterback wins that league pretty much every year. All right. After winning 11 games or more, 5 out of 6 seasons from 2010 to 2015, Stanford has lost 3 or more games 4 of the last 5 years under David Shaw.
Let's give some credit to your boy, Jim Harbaugh. So there is a program build in play, and then there's the program maintenance. Think a number of programs. Justin Fuente at Memphis comes to mind. He took that program from ruins, winning 2 and 3 games a year, built it up, left it to Mike Norvell. He maintained it. Jim Harbaugh did the same at Stanford. David Shaw took it over for the first 4 or 5 years. They're winning Rose Bowls. They're finishing in the top 10 to 15 in the country. Then they had that swoon to the 8 and 4 level, the top 20 to top 25. Now, based on what happened in 2019 and winning only 4 games, it will be fascinating to see if David Shaw is able to recover or if Stanford becomes the Stanford of pre-Harbaugh.
Our next one for Mark Rogers as we go through the data. Minnesota, Vanderbilt, and Iowa State enter the season with the longest championship droughts in major college football.
We could be sitting here 100 years from now and Vandy's still on that list. I just see no way out of that for Vandy.
I agree, yeah.
Iowa State has shown us something in recent years under Matt Campbell if they can keep him in town, and obviously P.J. Fleck.
They're the one team that, there's a lot of talk that Texas, Oklahoma State, Iowa State are pretty much bunched up for who's going to play Oklahoma in the Big 12 championship game. I can tell you right now, man, Oklahoma is rooting that it ain't Iowa State. mean, Iowa State beat them in their place a couple years ago, almost beat them again in their place last year. I think Oklahoma does not want to take their chances with Iowa State in a one-game setting. They have given them fits the last few years. And then Minnesota was a home win away against Wisconsin from ending its championship drought and winning the Big Ten West last year. So Minnesota especially looks like it's getting close.
Yeah, Matt Campbell is almost building a brand like a Wisconsin at Iowa State. You know what you're getting, you know what they do, and he's almost perfected the formula, at least to a certain rate.
All right, our next trend, assessing where things stand in 2020, this one blows me away. Since losing 5 games total from 2004 to 2006, the Tommy Tuberville days, Auburn has lost 4 games or more, Mark Rogers, 11 of the last 13 years. 11 of the last 13 years, and 6 of those years, they lost 5 games or more. Now, the other 2 seasons there that they didn't lose 4 games or more, they won the national championship with Cam Newton and then nearly won it again in Gus Malzahn's first year, okay? But those numbers, I mean, yowza. 11 of the last 13, and half of those they lost 5 games or more.
Well, Steve, before the numbers are presented, I tend to think of Auburn on that second line with Michigan, Notre Dame, Penn State below the elite. But when you present those numbers and think about Auburn, they have one of the oddest programs in regards to results. Think about their 2013 championship run where they came within 7 seconds of winning the whole thing against Florida State. The previous year, they were 0-8 in the SEC and went 3-9. I cannot think of a turnaround like that in the history of college football. Yes, Tommy Tuberville had if there's a school out there that should be able to claim a national championship, it's Tuberville and Auburn in 2004 going undefeated through the SEC and winning the Sugar Bowl. And then Gus Malzahn, he's keeping a job there. And since 2014, he's 26-22 in the SEC. That 2017 team could have been the first to go to the college football playoff with 2 losses. Beat 2 number 1 teams in the span of 3 weeks, but tripped over itself in the SEC title game and then to UCF in a somewhat embarrassing loss there in postseason play. So Auburn's a very uneven, intriguing program to me.
Well, you have the situation, too, where he's also beaten Alabama 2 out of the last 3 years. So
yeah, he is the best.
That's what saved his job. Are those 2 wins, probably.
He's 3-4 against Alabama since he's been there, which is like going 7-0 basically for anybody else.
By the way, Nick Saban has never beaten an Auburn team that finished with more than 8 wins. Did you know that? Never happened.
Not.
He's never beaten an Auburn team that finished with more than 8 wins. Another trend I could have put in there. All right, let's go with this one next. See what you think of this. Since 2007, if you just blindly bet on Temple in every game, you'd have won 62% of the time against the point spread. You'd be living large, actually. That's the best mark in college and major college football. What do we mean by blindly bet? You don't even look at the point spread. You don't care. You just go to the window and say, Temple, whatever the line is, I'm taking Temple. If you did that in every game since 2007, man, you'd be a very wealthy person right now.
Steve, it reminds me of the year that I thought that I could actually beat the Major League Baseball lines. And I took the Houston Astros, for example, that was at that time atrocious, like the worst, historically bad a couple of years before they made the run to the World Series. And I thought, looking back, that was the team to bet on every game because they were awful, but they weren't historically awful. You know, they started like 40-60. The only thing I can come up with here is that Temple has a stigma like Northwestern of the 80s.
Yeah. That
they're atrocious, they're awful, nobody cares, nobody goes to the games. This must be a trash of a football program. Plus, they have matched that kind of stigma with finding up-and-coming coaches that know what they're doing and put a good product on the field. And that's, I guess, the result.
All right, just a few more of these. Let's go with this one next. Rutgers enters the season with the longest conference losing streak in the country, 21 straight conference losses in the Big Ten.
And it's not just the losses, it's how they lose. And, of course, your team gave them the biggest butt-kicking of all, that 78-0. And if you look at the box score, and I'm a nerd for box scores, that was one of the more amusing box scores in the history of college football in analyzing the discrepancies between the 2 teams. But Rutgers, Maryland, the addition of those 2 to the Big Ten from a football standpoint, I'm not going to call it a disaster, but just not a good play for the Big Ten. It was not a football move. Of course, it was a money move that was based on the old model of cable television.
Yeah, now everything's digital, so the TV market's almost irrelevant now. So there you go. All right, couple more I meant to say. Over the last 15 years, if you just blindly bet favorites of 7 points or more on the money line in college football, money line meaning straight up, okay, no line. If you just blindly bet favorites of 7 points or more on the money line in college football over the last 15 years, you would have won 63% of the time. Now, this isn't as lucrative as the Temple deal because you'd end up Clemson's laying minus 4,000 against some FCS team, right? Okay. So you would not have, retired early like you would be just betting on Temple for the last 14 years, but still, you'd have yourself a nice little side nest egg, retirement, family vacation nest egg. Just every time there's a favorite of 7 points or more, I'm just putting $100 or $1,000 on the money line every time.
Yeah, I guess that speaks to the haves and the have-nots, and the haves just blowing out that money line or blowing out the point spread, I guess, is a more than touchdown favorite. The two numbers that come to mind that I've been trying to get a handle on have been if the point spread is within a touchdown. Actually, on the flip side of that, once you get to a touchdown or less, even though you're not going to hit 50% of your plays, it starts to become the better overall play to start taking the underdog against the money line and make the big money per win. And even if you only hit 40 to 45%, you're going to do that.
Yeah.
Similarly, Steve, over the last
because the odds work the other way. If you hit 40 to 45%, but it's plus 200, plus 300 all the time, you may not get the volume, but you're making it up in quality over quantity there, right?
And that's what I've been trying to find here the last few years. In addition to that, you got to find 5 to 6 upsets per week in the top 25 because that's what's going to present itself is about 20% of the games are upsets, a little more than 20%. So it's about 4 to 5 upsets per week in the top 25.
All right, here's another one. Since we started number 1 versus number 2 championship games with the BCS era in 1998, Mark, only 32 of the 88 teams in the preseason AP Top 4 finished there at the end of the regular season. 36%. That is it. Only 36% of the top 4 teams since we started the championship game era in 1998 have finished the regular season in the top 4. And the reason that matters now, of course, is because we have a playoff for the top 4. And it just goes to show that where you're at. We had a couple of years ago in our own league where Wisconsin was the number 4 team in the preseason poll. It's like highest ranking in the AP preseason poll in something like 60 years. And it went 7-5, right? So, Michigan last year was just outside the top 4. They were number 5. They went 9-4. So that top 4 that we see in August doesn't hold up typically when we get to December.
I got to say I'm surprised by that number. Especially since 2014, I've got to think with the dominance of 5 or 6 schools during that time that the numbers actually gone up, I would guess over the past 5 or 6 seasons that top 4 is generally making the playoffs and then going on to the championship game.
It's funny you should mention that. Last year was the first time in the playoff era that a team that was ranked 12th or lower in the preseason poll did not make the playoff. 2019 was the first time that wasn't the case. LSU, Oklahoma, Clemson, Ohio State were all ranked very high in the preseason top 10.
Yeah, I got to say I'm surprised by that number because it seems as though we talk about a sport here where it's pretty predictable, but maybe not as much as we all think.
So final thing before we let you go. That was the last one. Final thing before we let you go. Given the uniqueness of this offseason, the peculiarity of it, the lack of prep time, the fact that we've got some leagues, looks like the Big 12. Now, today, the NCAA announced everybody's getting a waiver for week 0. I'm a believer the season ought to start the last week in August anyway, so that every team gets 2 bye weeks for health and school and classes. That's when it ought to start anyway, okay? But the NCAA, granted, every school can start week 0 now. They can all start August 29th if they want. We're seeing Big 12 schools schedule games for them. I think, it's possible that we could see the Big 12 playing games August 29th, and we're not seeing the Big 10 or Pac-12 playing games till like September 19th, right? Depending on what everybody chooses to do. This is just such a peculiar offseason given the uniqueness of the pandemic. How many of these trends do you think are going to be threatened by this? Could it be a year where there's going to be a lot of chalk? Because if your culture and everything is not already preordained and established, it's really hard to make this up on the fly. Or is the randomness mean it's going to be 2007 on steroids? A 2-loss team wins the championship. Will we have like a dozen games that year where unranked teams beat top 10 teams? That was kind of a carnage season. 1990 was another one of those kinds of years. What do you think, Mark?
So that's what I've been wrestling with, Steve, because the initial response from me was wild card offseason, all this turmoil, all this uncertainty has to parlay itself into a wild card year. But aren't the better programs, the better coaches with the better facilities prepared for these type of situations more so than everybody else? So that's where I'm leaning at this point, that the heavyweights have an even greater advantage in this situation.
I would be where you're at. On the other hand, one Justin Fields positive test, one Trevor Lawrence positive test away from the whole damn season looks a hell of a lot different, brother, depending on when that test takes place, right? A lot different.
No doubt. No doubt.
So maybe we're going to get a little bit of both, meaning that the teams with the more solid structures are best prepared for this. But within that structure, there are elements that can take place that you can prepare yourself for all you want. But in the end, the event, the news of the world has its way, right? So anyway, fascinating conversation.
Like when a lottery number hits you. What just hit me right there, Steve, is split my Final Four. I got Alabama, Clemson, Iowa, Arizona State. How's that sound?
There you go. There you go. Hey, great stuff, man. We'll see you again next time here on Michigan Podcast.
Thanks so much, Steve.